Answer. Oh, is the microphone, turn the microphone on? Can you hear me now? Is it on? Is that better? There we go. Can you hear me now? Right, start again. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Duncan Ivison. I'm President and Vice Chancellor here at the University of Manchester. It's wonderful to welcome you to this extraordinary event that we're delighted to host tonight. We have a very distinguished audience tonight, and I want to begin by welcoming in particular Sarah Mangan, the Consul General of Ireland to the north of England, Deirdre O'Flaherty, the Vice Consul, Kate Green, Deputy Mayor of Greater Manchester, and of course, Dr. John Kennedy and his family, including Noella and Jack. We're delighted to have you here tonight. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. There are also people joining us online and who will be participating in the question and answer session after Dame Louise speaks to us. So note that there are people joining us in the ether as well. So this is our second lecture of the John Kennedy Lecture Series, which over the next 4 years will promote topics relating to the island of Ireland in the broadest sense of the term. And it's off to a remarkable start with the President being here last year and now Dame Louise being here tonight. Dr. Kennedy founded and made possible these lecture series. And he's passionate about putting something back, as he said to me as we were walking in tonight. And we are extremely proud to be associated not only with the Kennedy family, but with this event tonight. And I'm delighted that he and his family are here with us this evening. So please accept our warm thanks, John, for all your support for what you've done to bring this series to life. So because this is a university, we encourage lots of critical engagement and feedback. So there'll be lots of chances for questions and engagement with Dame Louise tonight. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Dame Louise back to the city of Manchester and to the University of Manchester and to introduce her to you this evening. Dame Louise was the first female president, is the first female president of the philanthropic foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. She is someone who has achieved a series of firsts. She was also the first female vice chancellor of the University of Oxford during a quite extraordinary time for that university, including during COVID, when Oxford helped the world deal with COVID through the development of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And she was the first female vice chancellor of the University of St. Andrews as well. She is, as I first knew her, is an extraordinarily well-recognized political scientist as well, an expert in terrorism and international relations, and is a recipient of many fellowships, awards, and honorary doctorates. Born in the county of Waterford in Ireland, Dame Louise received a BA in history from Trinity College Dublin, an MA in political science from UCLA, and an MA and PhD in government from Harvard, where she then spent 20 years on the faculty of the Department of Government. So a really remarkable career, which we hope to plunder tonight in one way or another. So Dame Louise is going to start by giving some reflections on her career to date and some reflections on what's brought her to this point in her life. And then we'll move to a conversation between the two of us to reflect on some of those themes, and also based on her, her current role and the work that she's done on the current state of global politics, among other things. So without further ado, Dame Louise, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for being here. It's an absolute pleasure to be back in Manchester, not a city I know well, but I've long known of its strong links to Ireland. So delighted to be just re-emphasizing those links today. Before I begin, though, let me thank John Kennedy and his family for being here and for supporting this lecture and supporting links between Ireland and Manchester. Because this is an Irish gathering, I thought I'd start with my Irish roots. I was asked to reflect, as President Ivison just said, on my career and what took me to this point. I don't know about you, but I really believe in the importance of imprinting, being imprinted as a young person with things that influences one throughout one's life. And I grew up, as you heard, in a town called Tramore, which is a seaside town. Tramore is the Irish for big beach, so as you can imagine, it has a big beach. In a very stable community. I grew up in my great-grandfather's house and was related to most of the people around me. And I remember my first day in secondary school. I went into Waterford for secondary school and was introduced to a nun who had taught both my mother and my grandmother. So it was a pretty stable environment. I also grew up with 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and that proved to be an enormous influence in my life, because there's nothing like having 3 brothers to explode the myth of male superiority. So it never occurred to me throughout my life that there was anything that males could do that I couldn't do as well. And that, I think, is purely a function of having grown up, much as I love my 3 brothers, but well, you know what I'm saying. But in the Ireland in which I grew up, one had ambitions for one's sons, but less so for one's daughters. I remember once asking my father what his ambitions were for his 4 daughters. And he thought about it for a while, and was clear he'd never thought about it before. He had thought about his ambitions for his sons. And then he said, well, that at least one enter the convent and none end up on the shelf. Now, to those of you unfamiliar with this term, that's a term for unmarried women. Women who are unmarried are left on the shelf. He didn't mean it in an unkindly way. He was incapable of being unkind. But that, in a sense, was the level of ambition for girls in the Ireland of the 1960s that I grew up in, at any rate. But it also speaks to the importance of Catholicism. And Catholicism was everywhere. It was the only religion we knew. We were vaguely aware that there were a few Protestants someplace, but and kind of oblivious to any other religions. And Catholicism was also an enormous influence on my life in a couple of respects. I think, well, the schools, of course, we were taught by nuns. But we were acutely conscious of the fact that there were people like us all over the world who were our equals in every respect. So every week we saved our pocket money and we brought them in to school on a Friday, and they went out to the missions, because it was instilled on us, and was a basic tenet of Catholic teaching, that everyone is equal in the eyes of God. And that was just a view that was instilled in me as a child, and I have never varied from, and that has proven to be a powerful force in my life. And the second is the sense, even though we were in this small community, very homogeneous, for a few people left, although like most families, I had an uncle who was in the missions, you were acutely conscious of the rest of the world, which may be counterintuitive, but precisely because of the missions and the role of the Catholic Church globally, you were very much aware of the rest of the world. This was reinforced, of course, by emigration. And like everybody else, we had cousins in America, and occasionally would get boxes of exotic hand-me-down clothes from the American cousins. And so those 2 tenets of equality, human equality, and internationalism, I think, were part of what propelled my academic career, my study of international relations. The other thing that was unquestioned, if you like, was a degree of republicanism. It was a version of Irish history that was really highly oversimplified, in which it was a long train of abuses by an imperial power, the nasty English, against the upright, poor Irish. It was an unsophisticated view of Irish history, but it was one that I fully imbibed, and went through a phase of speaking Irish in preference to speaking English, and wore a gold fáinne, and believed in believed in the Republican view of the world. And of course, it was my education that robbed me of that simplistic view of Irish history. I went to Trinity College in Dublin and learned an entirely different version of Irish history, and became fascinated by how two sets of people living on this one small island could have diametrically opposed interpretations of the same historical situation. And again, that's another theme that has influenced my academic pursuits, but also my belief that part of the point of education is to rob you of your certitudes, as it certainly robbed me of mine. Later, when I got to America and started looking at the literature on terrorism, I was really disappointed in it because they saw terrorists as one-dimensional bad guys and psychopaths. And I certainly thought it's much more complicated than that. So much of my academic work was based on trying to understand how people, like some of the people I knew who unlike me, did not move away from republicanism, but how people could be good teachers, upstanding members of society, could nevertheless join an organization and commit atrocities that violate every ethical code. And again, that's one of the themes that drove my academic work. The constant of my, or what propelled my journey from Tremor to where I am today and where I've been since, of course, has been the role of universities. I left for university in Dublin shortly after my 17th birthday, and I didn't leave universities until 2 years ago. So that's a case of arrested development if you ever want to see one. So I believe passionately in the power of universities to transform lives, and I believe passionately that universities are an unqualified good. They are, universities like this one, engines of the economy and guardians of our culture and drivers of social mobility. I think they're the very foundation of our democracy. And above all, of course, the generators of new ideas. So we will get on to the present day in due course, I'm sure, but it certainly pains me to see the collapse of trust in universities in the US. And it has pained me to see over the years, not just in the US, where universities are often used as political footballs. I didn't know what I was doing when I applied to university. I used to babysit a lot as a teenager, and watching television one time, I saw Austin Curry interviewed in the Late Late Show, and he said he had a degree in history and political science. And I thought, oh, I love history, I love politics, I'll do that. So my application to university was no more complex than that. I went to Trinity College Dublin because I read a lot and knew it was the best. And partly, I think, as an act of rebellion, because girls like me didn't go to Trinity College Dublin, because even then it was seen as a Protestant institution. And again, it was one of the most important decisions I ever made, because had I gone, as the few girls in my school who did go to university went to University College Cork, the adventurous ones, one or two may have gone to University College Dublin, but they would have been filled with girls like me or people like me. Whereas going to Trinity, I was completely out of my depth socially. I was in a small joint honours course of about 30 students, only a tiny handful of whom were Catholics. Most of the others had been to the same school. And so being an outsider, I think, is a wonderful position to have. It makes one so much more open to analyzing what you see around you. So being an outsider is a role I've always had to this day. Whenever I go, in Scotland, they didn't quite know, was I American, was I Irish, was I British? They decided I was Irish, and that was the best. But in America, they're unclear, is she British, is she Irish? And I delight in being hard to classify and being an outsider just because of the perspective it gives you. And I have 3 children, and they've grown up as very privileged children of professional parents, but I have always sought for them to be and to see themselves as outsiders, because I do think it just generates a degree of empathy that is missing if you take everything around you for granted. My the big break I got was one day reading the ads in the back of the Irish Times and saw that there was a scholarship by Rotary International that allowed you to study any subject in the world you wanted, any place in the world you wanted. And I said, oh, I've got to apply for that. I've never applied for anything at a national level, and this would give me a great opportunity to compete at a national level. Nobody was more surprised than I was when I actually won this, and which meant I could choose a university. There were a few constraints on universities you could choose. You couldn't choose more than 3 in one country and so on. And we had a very, very ancient encyclopedia at home. And I remember pulling it down, it was the World Book Encyclopedia, to look up American universities, because I wanted to put down some universities, American ones. And I looked up Harvard, and it said men only. Looked up Yale, it said men only. What I didn't know, of course, was that Harvard and Yale had long since become co-ed, but it was a very old encyclopedia. So, so I couldn't put those down. So I put down the Sorbonne, the University of Geneva, Georgetown, I think in Princeton, and I was looking for another one, and there was a picture of California and beaches in California and a University of California. I said, California sun, I'll put that one down. And again, never anticipating I would actually get this scholarship. So lo and behold, I got the scholarship and was able to go to California for a year. I had to have a meeting with the head of my department, Professor Moody, because I was studying history, to get permission to leave. And so I did eventually get permission on a couple of conditions. A, that I would get no credit for the year's coursework. And B, in order to be allowed back, I would have to take the exams that the students the year behind me were taking when they came back. So I said, no problem, for a year in the sun, that's fine. So that was a mind-opening experience, to be in California, to have no constraints on which courses you take. And I fell in love with the meritocratic nature of America, the can-do attitude, the meritocratic nature where nobody gave a hoot who your family was or whether you had money or not, or the culture in Ireland, a bit like in Britain, the universities at the time, it wasn't cool to be smart, so you kind of hid the fact that you were smart or were studying, whereas in America, people were totally open about it, and I love that. Anyway, so I fell in love with the States, came back, and resolved to go back to America for graduate school, and again, won a scholarship back to the US. So another theme in my career has been the kindness of strangers, has been the people who have generously supported scholarships in universities for people like me. At Trinity, I was able to pay my own way. I worked as a cocktail waitress at night and shoving books in the library in the morning, but American education is infinitely more expensive. So thanks to the generosity of strangers, I was able to fund that education. Then I initially got a master's at UCLA, then got another scholarship to Harvard for a PhD. And all this while, I was undecided about another theme was the Atlantic and which side of it I would end up on. And as you can see, I haven't ended up on either side. I've been bouncing back and forth. But I remember sitting down and trying to decide, would I get a PhD? Would I get a law degree? I realized if I got a PhD, I could potentially work on both sides of the Atlantic, so I opted for that. It was also easier to get funding for PhD than law school. But when it came to choosing a doctoral dissertation, again, not knowing which side of the Atlantic I'd be on, I chose to work on the countries that were most important to Ireland, which were Britain and America. I did spend a year in Britain doing archival research at the time. It's going to sound very impolite to say this to a British audience, but anyway, I was trying to decide which side of the Atlantic. Ireland is too small, America is too big, maybe Britain is the optimum size. Spent a year in graduate school in Britain, concluded that Britain combined the worst of both Ireland and America. So I said, I'm never staying in Britain. So I went back to America and made my career there. And as I mentioned, it was actually students who drew me into working on terrorism. I remember students coming into my office and saying, how come all your courses are on foreign policy and all your books are on terrorism? And I said, oh, that's just my hobby, studying terrorism, that is. And they said, you know, there's no courses on terrorism. Why don't you teach something about terrorism? So again, as I said, I was very taken with the fact that I felt the literature on terrorism at the time was really misplaced, saw it as a military problem. There was no effort to understand the motives of people who would join terrorist groups, no recognition that some of the goals of terrorists might actually be legitimate, even if their means certainly weren't, and so on. So I agreed to a bunch of students that I would give a small junior honors course. This is while I was teaching at Harvard. These courses were limited in size to 12. You usually had about 5. It was the one chance Harvard students had to be in a small class. And the requirements were very stiff, so it was for very good students. Anyway, I had 133 students sign up. So to prevent a riot, said I'd teach a lecture course the next year. And those of you who are lecturers know that there is nothing like having to write a semester's worth of lectures to force you to clarify your thinking on a subject. So that's how I got drawn into my academic work on terrorist movements. As it turned out, when 9/11, yeah, at the time it was a very marginalized field. When the head of my department told me I had to drop this terrorism stuff, it's academic suicide, nobody cares. It was a very marginalized field until 9/11 happened, and I found myself as the only person teaching courses on terrorism at Harvard. So in what is the worst case of career planning you're ever likely to encounter, actually, in July, I moved from being a associate professor of government in the government department to being executive dean at the Radcliffe Institute, which was the former women's college. So in theory, I was stopping teaching terrorism, but as it turned out, because of 9/11, I was drawn back into working on terrorism. Radcliffe was historically the women's college of Harvard, and actually that was why the World Book Encyclopedia, had I looked up Radcliffe, I'd have realized Harvard was in fact co-ed, but I didn't know to do that. Anyway, so I had just taken on this job at Radcliffe, and suddenly every Harvard club in the world wanted me to talk about terrorism. So I said, I'd talk about terrorism on condition I can talk about Radcliffe too. So ended up being able to marry, drawing attention to Radcliffe and winning support for Radcliffe while working on terrorism. At the time I was working on terrorism, I wasn't thinking so much about the practical application of this work. I remember there was somebody from the State Department Office of Counterterrorism used to visit once a year just to stay in touch with what we were doing, and used to get quite upset with us or quite upset with me for not focusing on the things he wanted to focus on. And I remember arguing, in fact, I gave a talk to the American Political Science Association called Mind the Gap, about the importance of keeping a gap between policy and academia, because I argued, look, I'm really not interested in arresting these guys. I'm interested in figuring out what motivates them and what motivates people to join. Once 9/11 occurred, my approach to counterterrorism was not a popular one in the US at the time, but it was one that I never tired of repeating. I argued very much against the war on terror, and that was a fairly lonely position at the time. I remember one of my children was at school, and the school asked me if I would organize a panel on the war in Iraq, pro and con. This was just before the outbreak of the war. And I, of course, agreed to do it and had no trouble finding 2 people to speak in favor of the war, and I was going to speak against it. But I couldn't find anybody to join me on the panel to speak against it. I eventually found a Quaker who was against all war, but that it was very difficult in the America of the time to make that case. In any event, it was terrorism that drew me to St. Andrews, because St. Andrews has the oldest center of the study of terrorism in Europe, if not the world. I served on its international advisory board, and when they were looking for a vice chancellor, I was approached, and I was so completely surprised when I was offered this role that I thought, if they're really willing to roll the dice on me like this, I've got to take it, because not only had they not had a woman before, or a Catholic since the Reformation, or an Irish person, I think, ever, there wasn't a single female in the senior leadership team of the university. And I think at the time, not one of the members of the senior team had a professional spouse. So I thought, this is going to be a challenge. This will be interesting. And I did make clear that I would never preside over an organization or any entity in which I was the only woman. So they had to be prepared for change. So that was my first real experience of being a first woman, if you like. And I do think, I was immediately plunged into the gender wars in a way that I had not at all anticipated, in part over golf. The local golf club was the Royal and Ancient Golf Club, which had always offered honorary membership to the head of the university. There's only two things in St. Andrews. There's golf and the university, nothing else for miles around except the North Sea. So the RNA was about 300 yards from the principal's residence. But they did not admit women, and certainly could not bring themselves to admit me. So you just got plunged into the gender wars, even though I didn't want to. I was totally pragmatic, saying I've come to run a university, but actually I think often the first woman has a responsibility to take these roles on, because it becomes much easier, I think, for subsequent women if the first person, I think, takes the sting out of it, as it were. So there were any number of things. I could tell you so many anecdotes. Well, even private clubs. So I got a letter offering me honorary membership of the Caledonian Club. I checked with one of my peers, the head of one of the other universities, who said, "Oh, it's great. It's a lovely club. It's right in London. It's very inexpensive. Absolutely, you should take it." And when I went on the website, I discovered that there weren't actually any lady members. There was a lovely pink tea room where lady associate members could have tea. So I remember writing back and saying, "Thank you very much, but it would put me in an impossible role entertaining guests of the university if they were in the dining room and I was in the tea room." Fortunately, the equalities legislation in 2010 changed it. But again, so I got drawn into waging these battles, whether I wanted to or not. It was also during a time of the independence referendum, which was a very charged time in Scotland, where there was the government of the day had a very strong view that, and made in no uncertain terms, told universities that we had to toe the line and we could not oppose independence, which I did, which made me rather unpopular with the First Minister, who was actually a graduate of St. Andrews. But it was an extraordinary experience to be there during the 600th anniversary of the university. And I had a chance to I had a chance to persuade Sean Connery to narrate a film about the 600th, which was great, but also try to introduce US-style fundraising. And I know that Manchester is about to launch a campaign. So I do think there's enormous potential for British universities in fundraising more than we have historically. While I was at St. Andrews, I got a call from a headhunter who told me about the vacancy in Oxford, and asked me to apply. And I said, I saw that vacancy, but I'm not going to apply. And he said, why not? I said, well, for several reasons. First, I love my current job. Second, I'm not finished my current job. Third, my next job would be back in America, because I have 3 children and my husband was still in America, so it was a bit complicated on the family front. And St. Andrews is not an easy place to commute to from Boston. And finally I said, we both know Oxford is never going to appoint me, so let's not waste each other's time. And he assured me it would be a significant conversation if I were to throw my hat in the ring, which I did. One of the most interesting parts of that whole process was the day I spent in Oxford, starting at 7 in the morning and ending with missing the last flight, the 9 o'clock flight to Scotland, with 1 hour meetings all the way through. It was called a familiarization visit. I had no prior connection to Oxford at all. And I called my husband from the airport and I said, I've had the most extraordinary day. I've just met, I'm not sure, 12 or 14 of the most erudite, interesting, intelligent people. And they've all told me exactly the same thing, which is that Oxford is ungovernable, it's totally unmanageable. You'll hate it if you come. If you try and do anything, we'll stop you. The last guy who tried to do anything, we get rid of him. We got rid of him. It's completely ungovernable. So my husband said to me, so if they offer it to you, will you take it? And I replied, you know me well enough to know if they offer it to me, I'm completely incapable of not taking it. Anyway, I ended up having a very happy 7 years at Oxford. During a time, like other universities, went through the COVID period, which was very difficult for all universities, but certainly, as Duncan mentioned, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was really such a powerful demonstration of what universities can do. So this vaccine was created absolutely on a shoestring. And we negotiated with AstraZeneca to manufacture at risk and distribute at cost in perpetuity in the developing world if it were a success. And the rest, as you know, is history. In the first year of its deployment, it saved an estimated 6.3 million lives at cost. So that's what universities can do. That was an academic collaboration with colleagues in India, in Africa, in Brazil, with the NHS around the country. It was one of the things I'm most proud of to have been a part of. I worry about this because I think AstraZeneca has not gotten the credit it deserves for taking that expensive, risky venture and doing that deal with us. I think it'd be much harder for any other company to do a similar kind of deal. But in any event, it has its own rewards. It was an enormous success. Another theme of my leadership in both St. Andrews and Oxford was trying to ensure that kids like me have access to places like that. So trying to open up the university to students who didn't have the financial wherewithal or didn't come from the kind of education from school or social milieu that would have led them to apply to an elite institution, people who are every bit as smart as others who had those advantages. And also tried to be creative about our finances. Again, doing a lot of fundraising. We went to the job market. We took out a £1 billion bond for 100 years at 2.4%. So that was something I couldn't believe we were able to do, but we were. Oxford has a 7-year term, so at the end of my 7-year term, I had to decide what to do next. Having run 2 universities, I thought I would really like to reclaim my life and do something slightly less all-consuming. I tell the story of shortly after I came back to the States, I was walking down the stairs looking at my phone, looking troubled at my phone, and my daughter Fiona said to me, "Mom, what's the matter?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got no work emails." And she said, "Mom, it's 6:45 on a Sunday morning. Most humans do not have work emails." So I had served on the board of the Carnegie Corporation of New York for 10 years, so I knew Carnegie. I don't know how much you know of the story of Andrew Carnegie. He was Scottish. His family were impoverished from Dunfermline in Scotland. They had the 2-room cottage in which they lived. The spinning wheel was downstairs. The family lived upstairs. They didn't even have the money to emigrate. They borrowed the money and emigrated. And he began life in America as a 12-year-old working as a bobbin boy in a a cotton factory in Pittsburgh. He went on to become the richest man in the world. At the time he sold Carnegie Steel to JP Morgan, the price was the equivalent of 2% of US GDP. But he, unlike more recent richest men in the world, he had a different attitude to his wealth. He had a view that you should spend the first third of your life learning as much as you can, the second third earning as much as you can, and the final third giving it all back. So he was completely self-educated. He had no formal education to speak of. A local merchant had a library, and he used to allow the boys who worked in the local factories borrow books from the library. So he borrowed a book every week, and he wrote years later about, just the power of that book and the excitement of reading it and the planning of which book he would take out the next week. And he then built 2,500 libraries, almost 1,700 in the US. I think about maybe 600, forget exactly how many in this country, I think several hundred anyway, and others in Africa, in order to, as he put it, provide a ladder for the aspiring. He loved libraries because he felt they were the foundations of democracy, because of their inherently democratic nature. So whether you're a prince or a pauper, you go into the library and you have access to exactly the same information, the same books, you're treated no differently. So he resolved to give all his wealth away. He funded Carnegie Mellon University, Carnegie Hall, a number of trusts in this country. Towards the end of his life, realized he wasn't actually going to be able to give it all away. So he created this foundation, which he had run out of names for all the institutions he created. So he called us a corporation, even though we're actually a foundation. Put the residue of his fortune in that, and then any money that would accrue to his estate after his death would go into that in order to advance peace and promote education. They were the two things he cared about most. He was so serious, by the way, about giving away his fortune that he had his wife sign a prenup. And in that prenup, long before they were a thing, he agreed to give her $20,000 a year, which was a significant sum at the time, and from which she would support any children of the marriage, but that she would make on his death no claim to his assets or his wealth. He was absolutely determined that he had no right to this money. He had made it, and he wanted to give it back. So that's the organization I run today, based in New York, and still guided by trying to advance peace, promote education, and to strengthen democracy. And arriving back in the US after 14 years away, it was really striking the powerless state of US democracy. Other countries are polarized, and we'll talk about this shortly. You see polarization all over, but the trajectory and the pace of polarization in the US in the years I'd been away was completely astounding. So I have redoubled our efforts to invest in libraries as trusted civic institutions, some of the few trusted civic institutions left, but also to try to figure out how do we address political polarization and how do we mitigate its corrosive effects on, in particular, American democracy. And we're taking short, medium, and long-term approaches to this. On the longer term, we're funding academic work to help us understand the phenomenon. In the medium term, we're supporting efforts at the state level. It's so impossible to make progress in the US at the federal level. We're working with states to have national service initiatives. So I'd be very interested to hear what the young people in the whole think about this idea. This is not military service, but community service, to allow young people to spend a year after high school and before college contributing to their community, working with an NGO, in the belief that, A, there are far too few opportunities for meaningful interaction across race, region, and class, but also in the belief that if people participated in their communities and contributed to them, they would appreciate them more, might appreciate democracy more, because the polling amongst young people's attitudes towards democracy is quite frightening. We're also investing in teaching civics in schools. We're investing in support for different types of structures, political structures. The primary system in America does tend to favor the extremes. A two-party system tends to favor the extremes. And we're funding lots of wonderful initiatives of people getting together, whether it's students, high school students from very different backgrounds to interact with one another, or communities with different points of view, trying to bring them together. Because what's happened is not just polarization, but what academics call effective polarization, so that increasingly you don't just disagree with somebody, but you actively dislike the person with whom you disagree. And there's been a dramatic decline, for example, in people of different political perspectives marrying one another. I'm about to end, and I can never end on a pessimistic note, because I do believe that universities are the last bastion of the optimist. And I do think there are some positive signs in the work that we have been doing. One of them is that smaller communities appear to be much less polarized than larger communities. Communities under 50,000 tend to be much less polarized. Second, we've done surveys both on that and on we didn't commission this survey, but on history teaching and what Americans believe should be taught, what's legitimate history to be taught in school. And it turns out that about 7% on the left and 7% on the right, on the extremes, have very strong views on what is and is not legitimate history to be taught. But the overwhelming majority of Americans converge on what history is legitimate to be taught in schools. Where they differ, though, is Democrats have a completely false view of what Republicans think is legitimate to be taught in schools, and Republicans have a completely false view of what Democrats think should be taught in schools. So there's actually far more convergence that isn't acknowledged. And all our polling also suggests that the political leadership is altogether more polarized than the population at large. So there are grounds for optimism, and I would argue that it took decades to get to this point. I mean, we've all read Robert Putnam and the Collapse of Social Capital and the rise of social media and the collapse of local media, all of which have contributed to polarization. So it's going to take a long, concerted effort to redress that polarization, but that's the mission I've set for myself at Carnegie, and I've probably talked far longer than I should, so forgive me. Thank you.
So thanks, Louise. And where I thought I'd start, just before we open it up to the floor, I mean, if we just combine your remarkable sort of life's journey and the institutions you've led, universities, elite universities, now the Carnegie Foundation, and many other kind of institutions in between and alongside. And you mentioned a couple of times that you saw universities, for example, as a real kind of foundation for democracy. And indeed, foundations like the Carnegie are another crucial foundation for democracy. And you mentioned how Carnegie was a great believer in libraries. You know, we have a remarkable library in Manchester that was, founded by a cotton magnate, or the widow of a cotton magnate, the John Rylands Library, that was open to the public from its first day, and still to this day, it's part of the University of Manchester. But you also said what frustrates you is people don't see universities like that. We're often at the heart of culture wars. We're seen as somehow on the wrong side of where governments and others want us to be. So if I could just flip the question for a second, what do universities and foundations need to do to be seen in a way that could make them more influential or more effective? In the UK over the last decade, and even today, there's a lot of criticism of universities as somehow being a problem that government has to solve. So what is it that you're thinking about in Carnegie, but also now reflecting, you don't have those work emails anymore. Probably you're very grateful for that. I have them though right now. They're actually coming through on my phone as I speak. So what do you think universities need to do? What's your advice to a new university president? What do we need to do to be seen as...
I would say three things, two of which my sense from meeting your colleagues today, you are doing. One is engaging with the community and being a trusted, not just employer, but contributor to the university, to the community in which you find yourself. The second, which I also have the sense that you're doing, is having your admissions process be fair and open and ensuring that everybody in the city has a reasonable aspiration to come and study in the top university in the city. The third thing that I don't think universities are doing, and they really need to do, is to make a concerted effort to have far more ideological diversity on their faculty. I think one of the real criticisms of universities, the criticism is less acute here, but I think the reality is as acute here as in America, and that's that there is a kind of left-wing or liberal orthodoxy in universities that breeds resentment by those who don't share it. Now, it's not easy to fix, because I've been aware of this and sought to fix it, because there is, I think, a selection bias amongst those who opt to become academics. By and large, if you opt to become an academic, you're not interested that much in money, earning lots of money. And so that you're more likely to be of a liberal bent if that's your value system. So it's harder to attract powerful conservative voices, but I don't think we've nearly enough strong conservative voices in our campuses. And if we don't, and if students who hold conservative views see themselves as being silenced, it undermines our legitimacy. And I think this has happened gradually over the years, and I would be making concerted efforts to address it.
And that might be another maybe subtle but still relevant factor in that, the entrenchment of polarization, right? Mm-hmm. People don't see the universities as challenging that polarization, but maybe even reinforcing it.
They well, certainly in the US, universities are seen very much a part of it, absolutely.
So just now, taking a step back from that and asking you to reflect from your kind of political science lens, as it were. So you've described the challenge of polarization as huge and as a genuine threat to democracy, not just in the US, but elsewhere, and that Carnegie's thinking of how to address that over the short, medium, long term. What kind of global politics are we going to experience, do you think, over the next sort of 5 to 10 years? Looking at it from your international relations lens, what kind of global politics are we going to experience? And how should countries like Ireland or countries like the UK or Australia or Canada, how should they be thinking about their resilience in the context of the changing nature of global politics? You know, tariffs, war, we have strategic competition, as political scientists say, now emerging as the norm. Mm-hmm. How should, maybe start with Ireland, or just more generally, what kind of global politics are we going to have, and how do the liberal democracies other than the US deal with that effectively?
A huge question, but a great question. Thank you. Well, there's no doubt that President Trump has upended US foreign policy, and so traditional alliances like NATO are now much more frayed than they have been, and Europeans are starting to imagine a world without the benign US presence that has underwritten everybody's security. At the same time, you have accelerated pace of progress in China, while the US is undergoing, let's say, turbulent times domestically, which will probably decrease their ability to compete effectively with China. So you're moving away from the end of the great optimism at the end of the Cold War, and a period where there was this benign hegemon, if you like, to a much more multipolar world. And you know, the big fear is what academics call the Thucydides gap, or the rising power and declining power end up fighting, and the hope is that that won't be the case between China and the US. But I think all countries have to navigate what their role is going to be and how they accommodate to the reluctance of the US to play the role it has historically. Now, there may be a tendency to say, let's just wait a few years and things will return to normal. But I don't think there will ever be a return to normal. I think European trust in the US has been badly shaken. Same is true, obviously, of Canada. And I think Europe now is going to be forced to pay for their own defense to a degree they have managed to avoid doing by, frankly, freeloading on the US for a long time. I think it's in the case of Britain, it's going to force a closer, we've just seen this earlier this week, a closer alliance with Europe, absolutely, on defense issues. And of course, Ireland has always delighted in being the exception to all generalizations. And we saw this in the recent election results in Ireland, where you had two centre-right parties return to power. But I think Ireland's position of neutrality becomes much more difficult to defend in this new world, especially given Ireland's relative wealth, at least as long as the current arrangements about all the multinational corporations based there. So I think Ireland is going to come under enormous pressure from its European allies to contribute far more to defence. I mean, those of us familiar with Ireland know just how difficult it would be politically to move away from the position of neutrality. And yet even the position of neutrality in Ireland is one that, again, it's a peculiarly Irish notion of neutrality. It's kind of military non-alignment is what it is, while everybody knows where the alignment really is. And there is, in fact, a cooperation with NATO and European defence. But given Ireland's wealth and the fact that it's enjoying these budget surpluses, it really can't get away anymore, I think, with contributing so little to its own defence. Now, the government has said it's going to dramatically increase defence spending, and it has, but it's from such a low base. And again, the Irish government has defended its position by saying, well, we give so much foreign aid that, in fact, if you combine our foreign aid and defence expenditure, we're not an outlier. But in fact, if you combine them, Ireland is still an outlier. So I think Ireland will be under particular pressure to take a more mature position towards its own defence. Britain is going to be forced, I think, to a closer alignment with European defence. The historic special relationship has been eroding for years, and I think that erosion is accelerating at the moment. And Europe more generally is going to have to start paying for its own defense and not relying on the US. But it's a much more complicated,
do you think,
world.
Just one more quick question for me, then we'll open it up to the floor. So I know there's some questions in the audience. I mean, just briefly, do you think there's an opportunity for Europe and the UK in this moment? Do you think, there's something there that strategists in Europe should be thinking hard about, or are thinking hard about, or in your conversations with people, do they see it as an opportunity potentially?
Oh, well, just to be clear, I think Brexit was a colossal act of self-harm. And while politically, just like Irish neutrality, it can't really be reversed at the moment, but ever closer alignment with Europe has got to be in Britain's interest and indeed in Europe's interest too. So yes, I think there's an opportunity for closer alignment. And then with the influence of the East Europeans, of course, have a far different attitude to NATO than West Europeans, and especially with the introduction of Finland and Sweden to NATO, these are countries with very experienced, very large, very strong militaries. So there is an opportunity for Europe, but it's going to be expensive, and it's going to create problems when there will be a conflict between social expenditure and defense expenditure.
Okay, let's open it up to some questions. We have a roving mic. I think we've got a question. Go ahead.
These polarized discussions can often be led by clickbait articles and headlines. The research both think tanks and universities do can be cited out of context to contribute to this. For example, a singular piece of research could contribute to the opinions of, say, climate change deniers. Do researchers have a role in avoiding this? And if so, how can we better communicate this research to engage in these public debates?
Thank you. I know your question was about communication. I'm not sure I caught all of your question. The sound wasn't good. I think what I heard you saying was, how do we communicate better the work that's being done at think tanks and universities, given the possibility that it can be used or abused or misrepresented? Yeah. I do think it's imperative that academics and think tanks become much better at communicating their research. We have a program called Bridging the Gap at Carnegie, precisely to try to provide skills to young academics or would-be academics to help them communicate their work. We also train journalists on issues like nuclear security so that their coverage is more sophisticated. There's no doubt that the work can be misrepresented, say, on climate change, but I don't think that's a reason not to communicate it. I think it's just a reason, A, to communicate it more effectively, to be much more assertive about communicating it. And I think we all need to take a stand against misrepresentation and disinformation. I mean, I think it's really tragic that in the past few days, the US administration has cancelled all research funding on mis and disinformation. I hope that foundations will be able to pick up some of the slack there. But I think it's imperative that think tanks and universities don't just talk to one another, but absolutely talk to the public as effectively as they can.
Thanks. I've got another question from the audience. We've got a roving microphone. We've got hands at the back or hands here. Maybe we'll just go there. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Dame Louise. With a name like Vincent Walsh, you can guess we share an Anglo-Irish Catholic heritage. I was taught by nuns, the Sisters of Mercy, and later did an M.Ed here. Now, my question really is about language and how we use it, particular word terrorism, right? We can perhaps all agree that last night, the incident, the fatal shooting of 2 Israeli embassy staff in Washington, D.C., is an act of terrorism. But I would ask, what about the actions of the Israeli government in indiscriminately attacking civilians in Gaza? Is that not state terrorism? And just in connection with that, you mentioned in your address about universities being an unqualified good and important to be influential. Therefore, I'd ask, why is this university, our university, the University of Manchester, investing in an academic institution sponsored by the Israeli government, which is currently terrorizing the citizens of Gaza? Namely, that institution is namely the University of Tel Aviv. So I'd urge the university and all of us here perhaps to lobby that investment should end immediately.
So I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about that. I think we'll allow Louise to
I don't mind commenting on that.
Tackle the first question.
I don't mind commenting on the second question. I believe passionately that I don't believe in academic boycotts of any kind. I think it's precisely when government relations are bad that academics should internationally collaborate with one another as best they can. We have certainly been funding Russian dissidents, Ukrainian dissidents, and so on. I think universities have an opportunity to forge alliances and should do so irrespective of what's happening between their politics. On your first question about terrorism, yeah, the problem with the term terrorism, it's so loaded. The only universally accepted attribute of the term terrorism is that it's negative. It's pejorative. It's something the other side, the bad side, do. My view of what a terrorist act is, it's the deliberate targeting of non-combatants for a political purpose. Now, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that governments have deliberately targeted non-combatants for a political purpose. The bombing of Dresden, Hiroshima, Gaza. When my work on terrorism was about terrorist movements as sub-state actors, it seems to me that we have a whole panoply of international law which we can use to adjudicate the behavior of states when they violate international law. But if we throw everything into a study of terrorism, we're never going to really be able to understand terrorism. So when in my work on terrorism, I exclude the behavior states, not because I think they don't commit acts that are the moral equivalent of terrorism, but purely to have a defined subject of study. But I'm sympathetic to the underlying point you're making.
Other questions? Yes, we've got a question right here on the side, right behind you, with a hand up right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I had a question on humanitarian funding and the risk of governance by extremist groups. So, how do you see the disruption of humanitarian funding shaping patterns of polarization and the rise of extremist groups in fragile or conflict-affected states? So, in cases where these actors become de facto authorities, like we've seen in Afghanistan and more recently in Syria, what are the risks of entrenching exclusionary systems? And does the international community still have a meaningful role to play? What research needs to be done to actually prevent these outcomes from happening?
No,
Thank you. Great question. Well, first, let me state the obvious. I think shutting down USAID is a humanitarian catastrophe. And I would describe it in the same words I described Brexit, as an act of self-harm, because I think it'll do untold damage to US standing throughout the world, but that's secondary to the extraordinary human suffering it's going to cause. In terms of actual polarization or even terrorism, it's not the destitute who tend to become members of terrorist groups, because usually they're too preoccupied trying to feed their children and stay alive. It tends to be societies that are relatively better off, or where there has been an improvement. So you pick a country, and the areas which have terrorist groups tend to be the better off than the average. So I don't think it will lead to terrorism per se. Your point about entrenching exclusionary practices is well taken. I mean, I wish I had a good answer to your question, what we could do to try to prevent this happening, or what research can be done. I mean, you have one of the very few centers for whom I visited with today, humanitarian research, and linked to medical research, which is, I think, really important and really fascinating. And I hope you take time to ask some of the academics there that question.
Good answer. Good answer.
It's a great question.
It's a wonderful
I don't have
question.
a good answer.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So maybe two more questions. So, and lots of hands. Why don't we just take a question right from the middle? The gentleman with his hand up right in the center there, and then we'll go to the back
Thank
row.
you. I'm going straight to the question. Two dimension. Number one, when we actually study terrorism, we study it more in a political way rather than philosophical and belief system of that individual or the whole community group. And second thing is, we start addressing the thing in a reactive way when something happened. What about thinking it in a proactive way and correcting the belief system and the philosophical causes? Just we call upon a group or individual tagging something. Why don't we dig deep? What is the belief system and philosophical system? Because nobody is actually reasonably will sacrifice his life, but why they are doing it? Would you mind commenting something about that, please?
I don't know about you. I'm finding it very hard to. I'm missing a lot of the questions, but I think I got your thrust. Why are we not addressing the root causes, essentially, of terrorism? And I agree entirely. Counterterrorism policy is one of the great tragedies of counterterrorism policy is that countries just repeat the same mistakes over and over again. They deal with it as a military issue. They try to resolve it militarily, eventually discover it's actually a political, not a military problem. Almost by definition, terrorists are outmanned and outgunned by their opponents, because nobody chooses to be a terrorist. It's only one wants change. If one had support for one's position, one could mount political opposition. If you don't have enough support to win politically, you could have an insurgency where you have significant support and use that support against a military force. People only resort to terrorism when they don't have enough support even to do that. The point about sacrificing lives, it's more complex. It's quite complex because very different terrorist groups have adopted policies of self-sacrifice. And sometimes this is much longer. I have really trouble answering questions about terrorism without talking for 50 minutes. I'm sorry. So in some instances, well, the Tamil Tigers were the first terrorist group that used large numbers of suicide bombers, for example. Then some years later, you saw religious Palestinian groups adopting very similar approaches to the Tamil Tigers in the sense of rewards to the communities, rewards to the families of those who sacrificed, great adulation for those who'd sacrificed themselves. And then you had the very political contest between secular and religious, particularly Palestinian groups, and the religious Palestinian groups were able to persuade people to self-sacrifice, and that gave them, for a period, a tactical advantage over political groups until the political groups then started figuring out how they too could persuade people to sacrifice themselves. So I think it's well nigh impossible on an individual level to counter a belief system. But I do think it's very possible to address the root causes or the perceived injustices that drive people to join terrorist groups. At the risk of being too nerdy, I tend to see terrorist groups, if you like, as divided by the nature of the goals they seek, whether they're transformational goals or political goals, and their links to the community from which they derive support. So the goal of counterterrorism seems to me should be to drive a wedge between the terrorist group and the communities from which they claim support. If you do that, then one can use conventional police power to counter them. If they have a wide base of support and political goals, you're going to have to negotiate with them. If they have, or else annihilate them and become only through state terrorism. If they have transformational goals and a wide range, deep-seated support in their community, that's the nightmare scenario for any counter-terrorist action. And the goal of all counterterrorism, I think, should be to ensure that you never find yourself in that quadrant. I hope that isn't too incoherent. I'm used to kind of putting that on a blackboard. Sorry.
Well, I mean, it was, Thomas Hobbes, the famous English philosopher, said, long before there was terrorism studies, said one of the problems in our politics is there are people who believe there's a fate worse than death, right? And it's that immovable force. Okay, last question. I realize we have questions on Slido, right in the center there. Yeah, we have questions on Slido, and maybe we'll save those, Louise, for the flight home, and circulate them then. So last question, and if you keep it really brief, that would be great.
Thank you, Louise. I wanted just to ask about the impact and influence of Russian disinformation on polarization of society. I think.
Sorry, could you say
Russian disinformation?
Okay,
yeah, just your comment, really. I think after the Southport stabbings, there's now substantial evidence it was the Russian disinformation campaign that fueled the far-right riots, which then obviously in turn fueled the kind of far-left response, and obviously caused a national security threat to the UK. So the first part is just kind of your comment and your views. And the second part, I just wanted to ask, what's happening with universities? Is there any uptake in studying Russian disinformation? Because I feel like people kind of realize it's a problem, but I don't see any solution. So, I would imagine the governments then go to universities and ask, what can we do? Thank you.
Thank you. I think Russia is a disruptive power. This is how it's dealing with its declining status. It's using conventional means to sow instability and disruption. I would add, the role of Russian disinformation in Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, in the riots in Dublin after the attack on the murder of some young children. The examples are legion. So I have to say I was just totally appalled a few days ago when the American government decided it was going to cease all funding on all federal funding for academic research on or government research on Russian or other foreign disinformation. I immediately wrote to all our team and said, please use your networks to find out if there are research teams there that we could help to ensure that they can complete their work. I don't think we don't have a lot of good information, but lots of indications that this is really a serious problem and it's growing, and we absolutely need to tackle it. And again, it's something on which countries could unite together. Looks like the US government isn't going to help in the short term, but I hope European governments will take it very seriously, as I think they are in fact doing, but need to invest much more perhaps than we have done.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this part of the evening. So let me just thank Louise enormously. I mean, it is challenging times, but I think we need more voices that combine a life growing up in Ireland with leading two of the world's great universities, now leading one of the world's great philanthropic foundations in a country that is taking aim at both philosophic foundations and universities. So you have a unique combination of leadership skills to bring to that scenario, and we've just been absolutely delighted to have you here tonight. So on behalf of everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, so I'd like to invite the audience again through the wonderful generosity of Dr. Kennedy and his family. We'd like to invite you for drinks downstairs to follow now, and for those who are coming to dinner, if we can just ask you to stay behind for a few minutes while people move down to drinks, that would be great. So thanks very much again for coming. Thank you.
Sorry, I spoke too long.
No.
You don't have notes.
No.